Have you ever stopped to think about what truly captures God's attention? It may be surprising, but fasting is one of the most powerful practices to do so. However, not everything that seems spiritual is actually pleasing to the Lord. Many people fast, but they end up making such serious mistakes that instead of bringing them closer to God, fasting pushes them further away. Yes, it happens. It's like trying to plant a seed in dry soil. You expect results, but nothing blooms. The issue lies in a lack of understanding. Fasting is not just about going without food or following religious rituals. It is a deep surrender, a demonstration of spiritual strength and humility that directly connects us to God's will. The interesting thing is that there are certain unnoticed attitudes that can completely nullify the power of fasting. Maybe you've made some of these mistakes without realizing it, or perhaps you're seeking to discover how to avoid them and finally experience God's true presence in your life. That's why it's time to demystify fasting. If you've ever wondered why your prayers seem to go unanswered or why your spiritual life feels stagnant, perhaps it's time to reassess how you fast. What you'll learn here can completely transform your spiritual experience. After all, who wouldn't want to practice a fast that truly attracts God's attention and unlocks unimaginable blessings? And here's the most incredible part. Discovering what not to do during fasting might just be the key to changing how you connect with God. So keep reading, because we're about to dive deep into this topic. And trust me, the next step will surprise you. Fasting, a command, not an option. Fasting is not merely a suggestion or an optional practice for those who follow God. It is a clear commandment. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus did not say if you fast, but rather when you fast. Matthew 6:16-18. This distinction reveals that fasting is a fundamental part of spiritual life. Just like prayer and charity, it is a pillar of Christian spirituality. Imagine a house without a foundation. It cannot stand. Similarly, a Christian without the practice of fasting loses an essential tool for strengthening faith and spiritual awareness. But why does God require fasting? Think of fasting as spiritual training. When we abstain from something as basic as food, we are reminded that we rely entirely on God for our needs. Fasting creates space for the presence of Jesus to fill our hearts and teach us to live in humility and dependence. It's like clearing out a cluttered room before welcoming a special guest. When we fast, we prepare our inner being for something greater. Even though fasting is powerful, it is often misunderstood or neglected. Some people view it as just an ancient tradition, but it has deep practical and spiritual effects. For instance, during fasting, you can use the time you would spend on meals to read the Bible, meditate, or pray. Try dedicating this period to reflecting on scriptures like Isaiah 58 or Psalm 23, seeking to understand how fasting transforms both the mind and heart. The heart of fasting, humility before God. Jesus emphasized that fasting should be intimate between you and God. He criticized those who fasted to impress others, showing that the wrong motivation can cancel out its spiritual benefits. This reminds us that the true power of fasting lies in sincerity and spiritual purpose. When done correctly, fasting becomes a gateway to deep encounters with God, preparing us for greater challenges, as demonstrated by David and Daniel in their stories. Speaking of challenges, what about the way fasting teaches us to humble our souls? Let's explore this in the next section. Fasting is one of the deepest ways to demonstrate humility before God. In Psalm 35:13, David describes how he used fasting to humble his soul. When we fast, we acknowledge that our own strength, no matter how impressive, is limited without God's presence. It is an act of surrender, of putting pride aside and admitting that true strength comes from Jesus, not from our human abilities. This kind of humility is rare in today's world, where everyone wants to appear strong and independent. However, by fasting, we abandon this mentality, showing that we depend entirely on God. For example, when you choose to fast, you are saying, "Lord, I choose to trust you to sustain not only my body, but also my soul." It's like trading the spotlight of self-reliance for the divine light of grace. Fasting strengthens prayer. Fasting is not merely an exercise in physical deprivation, it amplifies something much greater: our prayers. In Daniel 9:3, we see the prophet turning to God with fervor, combining fasting with supplications. It's as if fasting is a spiritual megaphone, intensifying the power and clarity of our communication with God. It not only draws us closer to Him, but also helps us align more deeply with His will. Have you noticed how our prayers can sometimes feel rushed or scattered? During fasting, the mind and heart align, allowing prayer to become more focused and powerful. Try using the time you would spend eating to dedicate yourself to prayer. Choose specific topics to intercede for, perhaps a loved one's health, a purpose God has placed in your heart, or even gratitude for blessings already received. Additionally, fasting teaches us to persevere in prayer. Think of Elijah, who fervently prayed for rain to return to Israel and only saw results after his 7th persistent prayer. This determination also grows within us when we fast. It is a way of saying, "God, I am here, body and soul, seeking your intervention with all my strength." This combination of fasting and prayer generates spiritual power beyond what we can imagine. It's not about manipulating God, but about positioning ourselves to listen and trust. And speaking of trust, have you ever considered how fasting can break spiritual chains and set us free from oppression? That's what we'll uncover in the next section. Fasting, a weapon for spiritual breakthrough. Fasting is much more than a simple spiritual practice. It is a powerful weapon for deliverance. In Isaiah 58, God speaks of true fasting as one that breaks the chains of injustice and unties the cords of the yoke. This shows that fasting has the power to break spiritual bonds that hold us captive, bringing freedom and renewal to the soul. It's like opening the windows of a suffocating room, letting fresh air in to transform the atmosphere. How often do we feel trapped by habits or thoughts that seem impossible to overcome? Fasting, combined with prayer, acts as a catalyst to break these chains. For example, someone struggling with unforgiveness can use fasting to seek God's strength to release genuine forgiveness. Or someone battling anxiety can find divine peace while fasting, surrendering their fears to the Lord and receiving back the positivity that comes from faith. Fasting done right, avoiding common mistakes. Although fasting is a powerful spiritual practice, it can be hindered by simple yet significant mistakes. One of the most common is fasting with the intention of impressing others. Jesus was clear in Matthew 6:16-18 when he condemned this attitude, warning that those seeking human approval have already received their reward. Fasting is not a performance, but an intimate connection with God. The motivation behind it determines its spiritual impact. Another frequent mistake is treating fasting like a diet. Swapping meals instead of abstaining is not its biblical purpose. For example, replacing lunch with a healthy salad might benefit your body, but not your spirit. True fasting goes beyond food. It is a period of surrender and seeking God, not a weight loss strategy. When these errors are avoided, fasting becomes a practice filled with spiritual power and divine connection. And that leads us to the true essence of biblical fasting, what we will explore next. Final challenge. Will you apply this truth? Now that you understand how fasting is a powerful tool to attract God's presence and transform your life, the big question is, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you let distractions and common mistakes prevent you from experiencing its true spiritual power? Or will you apply these truths and embrace a biblical fast that brings freedom, strength, and a deeper connection with the Lord? If this message touched your heart, share in the comments how you plan to apply this teaching. And don't forget to subscribe to Heaven's Wisdom and turn on notifications, because the next content might be exactly what you need to take your faith to the next level. Let's grow together.